The giant didn't die because it was too small. It died because of something thinner than your little finger. A wire. Its name comes from the Bible. A giant sent out ahead of an army built to be unstoppable. That was the idea anyway. The real one stood barely up to a man's knee, tracked low enough to hide in knee-high grass, with armor plating thinner than a coin, not built to stop a bullet, only to catch a fragment or a glancing shot packed with explosive, and it rolled toward its target on command, from a soldier crouched hundreds of meters back, safe behind cover, working a joystick with his thumb over a button. Between that soldier and his machine ran the cable. Nearly 2/3 of a kilometer of it spooling out behind the vehicle across whatever ground it crossed, rubble, sand, open steppe. 2 strands to steer it, one to complete the circuit that would blow it apart along with whatever it reached. Cut the wire, and the giant simply stopped. Stood there in the open, in the rubble, in the mud, a few 100 kilograms of dead steel and live explosive, waiting for an order that would never come again because nothing was listening anymore. It wasn't tanks that beat this machine most often. It wasn't artillery or aircraft or a rival design out-engineered on some German drafting table. It was people home army fighters in Warsaw with nothing but rifle fire and axe, or the nerve to sprint across open ground with a blade and find a cable barely thicker than a pencil before the man on the other end of it could stop them. Germany built more than 7,000 of these machines and named every one of them after history's most famous giant, the one felled by a boy with a sling. Nobody in the Wehrmacht seems to have thought hard about what that name was promising. Every single one rolled off the factory floor, already carrying its own death sentence, coiled up behind it like a tail dragging across the ground for anyone patient enough to find it. In late 1940, somewhere along the Seine outside Paris, a French engineer did something small, and in the end completely pointless. His name was Sd.Kfz. He was not some amateur tinkering in a garage. Years earlier, he'd invented the half-track suspension system that would go on to carry armies across half the world, French and German alike. Before the invasion, he had been developing something else, a small remote-controlled tracked vehicle that could carry an explosive charge into a target no soldier needed to walk toward. France fell before he could finish it. Kfz did not want the men who had just taken his country to get their hands on his last invention, so he sank it. Somewhere in the river waited down out of sight, an idea drowned on purpose. The Wehrmacht's Ordnance Bureau found it anyway. Fished out, crated, and handed to Borgward, a Bremen manufacturer that already built military trucks and half-tracks for the Wehrmacht. Borgward's engineers didn't copy Kfz's machine. Outright, they used it as a starting point, a proof that the basic idea worked, and built their own design around it from the ground up. The result carried a French engineer's fingerprints on its concept, but German hands on every rivet. By the spring of 1942, that idea had a designation, Sd.Kfz 302 on the manifest. Leichter Ladungsträger light charge carrier in the official paperwork. Something else on the battlefield. Goliath. The irony sat right there in the name, and nobody in the Wehrmacht seems to have paused over it. A giant sent ahead of the army meant to be unstoppable. The real one stood barely knee-high, not much longer than a man is tall, weighing close enough to a small motorcycle that crews moved it on a 2-wheeled handcart rather than carry it. A soldier jogging at an easy pace could outrun it in the open. Nothing about this machine was built for speed. What it had instead was skin thin enough that a rifle round could punch straight through at close range, good for turning aside a shell fragment or a glancing hit, and not much else. It didn't need to outrun anyone, and it didn't need to shrug off a direct hit. It needed to survive long enough to arrive. Twin electric motors from Bosch drove the tracks on the first version, roughly 2.5 kilowatts apiece, enough to crawl the machine forward at walking pace, not enough for anything more ambitious. 60 kilograms of explosive, rode in the hull enough in German field practice to flatten a barricade or bring down the corner of a building, though not enough to crack a hardened bunker. That heavier job belonged to a different, larger machine entirely. One this story circles back to later because mixing the two up is exactly the mistake history itself would go on to make. Cost roughly 3,000 Reichsmarks a unit for the electric model, real money for the German war economy, spent on a weapon that would be used exactly once and then either destroy itself, completing its mission, or sit wrecked as scrap. An operator crouched behind cover with a control box in his hands, working a joystick paying out cable as the machine crawled forward. 2 strands to steer left and right. A third to complete the firing circuit. Nearly 650 meters of wire between the man and the explosion he was about to trigger enough distance on paper to keep him safe from whatever he was aiming the Goliath at. On paper, because that cable had to run the entire distance in the open. Across mud, across sand, across whatever a Wehrmacht engineer needed, the Goliath to cross trailing behind it, the entire way, visible exposed, and doing the one job in the whole design that could not be armored, hardened, or hidden. A wire doing the work of a nervous system with none of the body's protection. Cut it, and the giant simply stopped. Mid-stride, mid-mission, mid-anything. A few hundred kilograms of steel and live explosive going nowhere, waiting for a signal that would never arrive again. That was the whole design compressed into a single point of failure, a literal one, not a metaphorical one, thin and exposed, dragging across open ground the entire time it mattered most. By 1944, the electric motors had mostly given way to gasoline engines from Zundap that ran longer and farther, 7 kilometers of range, off-road, instead of the electric model's short leash, and payloads had grown toward 100 kilograms in the largest variant. Production would eventually reach more than 7,500 units across every version built. Enough Goliaths in raw numbers to have equipped an entire engineering corps with disposable explosive robots, one for every soldier who might otherwise have had to carry a satchel charge into the open himself. Germany would go on to lose nearly every major engagement in which they were used at scale. Because somewhere along every front where a Goliath rolled forward, there was already someone working out exactly where that wire ran. A trench, a doorway, a pile of rubble, somewhere close enough to reach it before the operator's thumb found the button. That reckoning wouldn't wait for Warsaw or Normandy or Kursk. It was already built into the machine the day it rolled off Borgward's production line, coiled up behind it like a leash nobody had thought to shorten. Somewhere on the Eastern Front, a German combat engineer knelt behind cover for the first time with a joystick in his hands, watching a machine the size of a large dog crawl toward a Soviet position. For the first time in this war, he was not the one who had to walk into the minefield. That was the entire pitch. That was the reason this machine existed at all. Breach the bunker, blow the barricade, clear the mines. Do the job that had always meant sending infantry forward first into the exact ground the enemy had spent weeks preparing to kill them on belts of anti-personnel mines, log and earth barricades, concrete pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire, and do it instead with a few hundred kilograms of expendable steel that nobody would have to bury afterward. Every army fighting this war had already learned the arithmetic of a frontal assault against prepared defenses. The first wave dies clearing the ground, so the second wave can advance. German combat engineers, the Pionier, had carried that arithmetic since 1939, men trained to crawl forward under fire with nothing but a satchel charge and a length of fuse close enough to a bunker to feel the heat off its gun ports before they could destroy it. The Goliath was pitched from the very beginning as the answer to that job. Send the machine, keep the man behind cover. The first operational units, Panzer Pioneer Companion 811 through 815, under a battalion nicknamed Typhoon, took the Goliath into combat starting in 1942 and 1943 with exactly that doctrine in mind. Breach first, send the men in after once the ruins had already stopped shooting back. July 1943, Kursk, the largest tank battle in history and the Goliath's first serious test. Goliath supported the 78th Sturm Division of 23rd Corps, 9th Army against Soviet minefields and dug in positions on the northern face of the salient. A separate, larger machine, the Borgward 4, radio-controlled instead of wire-guided, carrying several times the explosive payload, worked that same stretch of front near Poniri. That same month, clearing lanes for the Ferdinand tank destroyer battalions. 2 different vehicles, 2 different guidance systems, 2 different companies operating them. Remember that distinction. Popular accounts of this war routinely collapse the two into one machine, and in Warsaw, a year from now, that same mistake will cost hundreds of lives. A German assessment from the period put the Goliath's actual performance at Kursk plainly. Whenever a Goliath reached its target, the effect was striking. Mostly, however, they did not reach their target. Mostly they didn't get there at all, stuck on rough ground. The low-slung tracks couldn't climb, spotted and destroyed by artillery long before they closed the distance, or simply outrun by an enemy who'd already worked out what the shape rolling toward them meant and put fire through it well short of its target. Open steppe country gave Soviet gunners exactly what Warsaw's allies would later deny German operators: a clean, unobstructed shot at both the machine and the man steering it for as long as it took to cross open ground. But even when a Goliath did everything right, even when it crossed open-mined ground exactly as designed and detonated exactly on target, the man who sent it there hadn't actually gone anywhere. He was still crouched a few hundred meters back, cable spooling out of the control box in his hands, in a position an enemy sniper or a ranging artillery round could reach almost as easily as it could reach the infantry. He was supposedly sparing. 650 meters of wire sounds like distance. On an open battlefield with modern optics and long-range guns already common on both sides, by 1943 it wasn't much distance at all. The operator still had to see his target to guide the machine toward it, which meant staying exposed in position, cable in hand, for as long as the mission took. He couldn't duck fully behind cover and steer blind. He had to watch the ground his own machine was crossing, which meant the ground behind him was watching him too. The premise was protection through distance. In practice, there was almost no distance in it. A man was still kneeling in the open, still within range of everything that could kill the soldiers around him, the same mortars, the same sniper fire, the same artillery barrages that made the minefield deadly in the first place, just holding a joystick instead of a rifle, and hoping the giant in front of him reached its target before something behind him found his position first. The Goliath was sold as a way to keep German soldiers out of the line of fire. What it actually did was move the line of fire a few hundred meters closer to where the operator happened to be standing. On the morning of June 6, 1944, a 21-year-old Navy frogman named Dennis Shryock stopped mid-chaos to watch something that looked like a toy roll toward him across the sand. He was a member of a Naval Combat Demolition Unit, part of the first wave onto Utah Beach at H-hour, roughly 0630, tasked with clearing obstacles under fire so the landing craft behind him could reach the shore. It was work that left no time to watch anything, charges to place wire, to string men going down around him in the surf, before most of the invasion force had even set foot on sand. And then rolling out from a camouflaged German position low to the ground, tracked moving at not much more than walking pace, came a machine Shryock had never been briefed on and had no name for. In the chaos of the moment, the only comparison that came to mind was a remote-controlled toy. It was not a toy. It was a Goliath, one of a small number positioned along the Normandy beaches, dug in behind the same bunkers and obstacle belts American engineers had spent the morning blowing gaps through. Sent out to do exactly what it had been built to do, reach the invasion force, and detonate before infantry needed to close the distance themselves, breaching a landing the way it had been designed to breach a minefield. It never got the chance. Naval gunfire and shore-based artillery had been hammering the German positions since before the first landing craft touched sand, and in that bombardment, more than one Goliath control cable was severed before an operator could complete a run. A wire lying exposed across open beach under a bombardment That dent didn't need a soldier with a blade to find it. A single fragment of shrapnel did the job just as well, the same design flaw, defeated by an entirely different kind of blade. Shryock survived the landing with nothing worse than a chipped tooth, one small injury on a beach that still cost the Americans some 200 killed wounded and missing before the day was out, the lightest casualty toll of any Normandy beach, and still not light. The Goliath he watched never reached the water's edge. Whatever it had been sent to destroy it detonated somewhere behind the tide line or never detonated at all. Normandy's open sand had given Allied naval guns exactly what Kursk's steppe had given Soviet artillery months earlier, a clean shot at a slow, low target with nowhere to hide. Two different armies, two different continents, separated by a year and thousands of miles, and the same weakness, found the same way from a distance, with heavy guns against a machine that had no cover to retreat to, and no speed to outrun what was coming. The next place this machine would fight offered its enemies something entirely different from a fleet of warships and a coordinated barrage buildings close enough to touch streets too narrow for artillery to matter, and men with nothing heavier than a rifle who were willing to close the last few meters by hand. On August 1, 1944, a general named Tadeusz Komorowski, the men called him Boer, gave the order that started the Warsaw Uprising. He had no way of knowing that within 2 weeks he'd be writing a report to the Polish government in exile in London describing a machine most of his soldiers had never seen before, a giant sent ahead of Tiger tanks that his men would learn to disable with nothing but a blade and their nerve. Boer Komorowski commanded the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, tens of thousands of fighters, most of them civilians with weapons rising against an occupying army that had held their capital for 5 years. The plan called for a matter of days. The Red Army was already on the far bank of the Vistula, close enough that Warsaw could hear Soviet artillery on clear nights. Liberation looked close enough to reach out and touch. It did not come. The Red Army stopped at the river and stayed there. Warsaw would fight this battle alone against an army that had already decided what the city's punishment would be. What came instead was the answer Heinrich Himmler gave Adolf Hitler when he was told the city had risen, Warsaw will be liquidated, and this city will have ceased to exist. That was not a threat delivered in private and left unfulfilled. On August 5, 1944, a date survivors would come to call Black Saturday SS units under Heinz Rheineffarth moved into the Wola district at 7 in the morning with roughly 4,000 troops. An hour later, a second assault hit the neighboring district of Ochota, roughly 1,700 men, including the SS Rona Brigade. These were not soldiers advancing on a defended position. They moved house to house, street to street through a civilian district, and over the following 2 days, they killed an estimated 35,000 to 50,000 civilians, regardless of age or ability, to fight back among the largest single-event massacres of the war in Europe, carried out in the same streets where a machine named after a biblical giant would soon be rolling toward Polish barricades. One survivor of Wola remembered the sky that week as an orange haze thick enough to blot out the sun ash from the burning district hanging in the air over a neighborhood that had just lost most of its population. That is the air this machine would be moving through 6 days later. That is the context this machine operated inside, not a footnote to the story itself. That is what combat in this city actually meant by the second week of August 1944, before a single Goliath ever reached a barricade. 6 days later, on August 11th, at roughly 8 in the morning, the Goliath made its confirmed combat debut in Warsaw against Home Army positions near the intersection of Ulica Dzika and Ulica Okopowa, in the same district that had just buried tens of thousands of its own dead. 2 vehicles went in. One was immobilized before it reached its target. The other detonated. Boer Komorowski described the tactic in his own report filed for the government in exile to read in London. The Goliaths were the first to attack. Their object was to blow up barricades and heavy concrete structures. The Goliaths were followed by heavy Tigers which attacked while firing at short range. Only then did the infantry begin. By that time, they were usually faced with ruins. Send the machine first. Let it clear what stood in the way. Bring the tanks in behind it to finish the job at close range. Only then risk the infantry into ground that had already been reduced to rubble by everything that came before them. The same doctrine born on the Eastern Front. Protect the men, spend the machine now applied against a city, instead of a minefield against barricades built by resistance fighters and civilians instead of Soviet engineers. But Warsaw was not open steppe, and it was not a beach. It was a medieval city center, and the ground itself was about to fight back in a way no German planner had accounted for. The old town streets had been laid out centuries before anyone imagined a machine like this would ever need to move through them. Narrow winding lined with thick stone buildings, cellars connected by passages. A sewer network the resistance would come to use as an escape route when the streets above became impossible to hold. Historians have described fighting for the old town as fighting for a medieval fortress, and the comparison holds. This was terrain built to slow down an attacking army centuries before tanks or tracked mines existed, and it did its job just as well against 1944 technology as it had against 1944's predecessors. A Goliath needed roughly 11 centimeters of ground clearance to cross uneven ground, and an operator who could actually see where he was steering it. Warsaw's rubble-choked alleys offered neither an easy path nor a clear view. Every collapsed wall, every barricade built from paving stones and overturned carts was an obstacle this machine had never been designed to climb and cover for exactly the kind of close-range attack its open-ground service record had never had to survive. The same 650 meters of wire that was more than enough range on an open beach or an open steppe became a liability here. Dragging across debris a man on foot could step over without breaking stride, but a low-slung tracked machine couldn't cross at all. The same geography that trapped the Goliath's slow speed also gave the people fighting it something they'd never had against a tank time and an angle. Home Army fighters had already worked out where the wire ran. 650 meters of cable, no thicker than a pencil, laid across open rubble, in full view of anyone watching from a second-story window or a doorway 30 meters away, was not hard to find if you knew what you were looking for. They cut it with whatever they had. Rifle fire aimed at a target you could barely wrap 2 fingers around. Grenades thrown close enough to sever the line by concussion alone. An axe swung by a fighter who had sprinted across open ground to reach it, counting on speed and the machine's own slow crawl to buy him the seconds he needed. This was doctrine, not luck, a recognized, repeatable countermeasure that Home Army fighters trained each other to execute, because a cable that thin cut once stopped the entire machine dead, and that was worth more than any weapon most of them had. Their arsenal was thin, scavenged rifles taken off dead Germans, a handful of smuggled grenades, axes meant for firewood, whatever a besieged city's kitchens and workshops could still supply. Volunteers willing to close the distance, a Goliath's own wire had never actually protected and cut it. This is the David and Goliath frame, made literal, not metaphorical. A giant walking into a fight, it had every mechanical advantage in defeated by people using nothing but their own nerve and an understanding of exactly where its one weakness ran. Across the whole uprising, roughly 90 Goliaths were committed to combat in some 56 separate attacks, a fraction of the more than 7,000 the factories had built spent one at a time against a single besieged city. 5 were captured outright, hauled away by the same fighters who disabled them. 11 were immobilized before they reached anything at all. A larger number still detonated early, or hit nothing but rubble, or simply stopped where their wire had been cut and sat there inert for whoever wanted to walk up and look at what German engineering had actually sent into that city. The giant that was supposed to clear the way for Tigers kept getting stopped by lightly armed volunteers instead, over and over in barricade after barricade. The machine wasn't poorly built. The city itself, its narrow streets, its rubble, Its sight lines was exactly the kind of ground this design had never been tested against and never survived. August 11, 1944. The day the giant finally showed up in Warsaw, in a district still counting its dead from 6 days earlier. The day the city that would go on to break its design, one severed cable at a time, first got a good look at what it was fighting. Ask most people what the deadliest Goliath story of the Warsaw Uprising is, and they'll tell you about a single afternoon on Kiliński Street. They'll be wrong about one crucial detail. Around 9 or 10 in the morning on August 13, 1944, 2 days after the Goliath's confirmed combat debut in Wola, a German demolition vehicle advanced on a Home Army barricade at Podwale Street, escorted by 2 Panzer IVs. This machine was larger than a Goliath guided by radio instead of a trailing wire carrying roughly 500 kilograms of explosive, more than 8 times what a standard Goliath carried, closer in destructive power to the bombs Allied aircraft were dropping on German positions elsewhere in Europe that same summer. Its real name was the Borgward 4 Sd.Kfz 301, operated by the 3rd Company of Panzer Abteilung 302, a Funklenk unit descended from the same radio-controlled program that had worked the minefields at Kursk a year earlier on a different battlefield entirely. The Home Army's Gustav Battalion firebombed it with Molotov cocktails, improvised weapons, against a 500-kilogram armored vehicle thrown by fighters who had almost nothing else in their arsenal capable of stopping it. The German driver fled the burning vehicle rather than stay with it. Polish fighters took it mostly intact, sitting in the street they had just defended. Among those who moved the captured vehicle away from the barricade, 2 named fighters, Henryk Paczkowski, known by the nom de guerre, Shawiński, and Zygmunt Salwa, known as Chimbo. Ordinary Home Army soldiers, not demolition specialists, not intelligence officers, men who had just watched their side capture a piece of German armor in a district that had spent the previous week burying tens of thousands of its own civilians. They had no way of knowing what exactly they had captured or what was still sitting inside it. Around 5 in the afternoon, the vehicle was paraded through the Old Town marketplace. A crowd gathered, cheering, shouting that a tank had been taken. For a few hours in a city that had endured a massacre 8 days earlier and a giant machine's combat debut 2 days before that, this was a rare visible win, something to celebrate in the open, in daylight, in the middle of a fight that had given its people almost nothing to celebrate. Around 6 that evening, crossing a barricade on Kiliński Street, the vehicle's explosive container detached and detonated. More than 300 people were killed. Some accounts put the number closer to 500. The heaviest losses fell on the Orlęta Company and the Gustav Battalion, the same unit that had captured the vehicle in the first place. Bor Komorowski himself was injured nearby. Whether the detonation was a deliberate trap built into the vehicle by German engineers who anticipated exactly this outcome, or a mechanical accident triggered by the same rough ground that had already broken so many Goliaths, historians cannot say for certain. Both explanations are plausible. Neither has been proven. What can be said plainly, the people who died on Kiliński Street were for the most part the same people who had just risked their lives to capture the machine that killed them. Paczkowski and Salwa were not reckless. They had captured a piece of enemy hardware in the middle of a war that had given their city almost nothing but loss in a district that had spent the previous week burying tens of thousands of civilians killed by the same army that built this vehicle. They had no way of knowing what was still inside it, and no reason to assume the worst about a machine that had just been driven away by a fleeing German soldier. And the vehicle that killed them was never a Goliath. A caterpillar track fragment is still embedded in the wall of St. John's Archcathedral in Warsaw's Old Town today with a commemorative plaque. The plaque calls it a Goliath. It is not. It never was. Decades of retelling folded the wrong name onto the wrong machine and left it there uncorrected on a physical memorial that thousands of visitors walk past every year. This is the sharpest version of an argument that keeps resurfacing in this story. A weapon can develop a reputation that outlives the facts of what it actually did, inflated not by German propaganda this time, but by history's own habit of collapsing two similar machines into one convenient story. The Goliath's name carried the weight of a killing it never committed. Its actual record, mostly failing to reach its targets, mostly stopped by a cut wire before it could do anything at all, sat somewhere between the myth and the record it deserved, less fearsome than the Kalinsky Street story made it sound, and still no harmless curiosity, not in a district that had already lost tens of thousands of people to the army that built it. By the start of 1945, somewhere inside the German war machine, an uncomfortable fact had become impossible to ignore. Any longer the giant wasn't changing the war. It was starting to look like it never could have. The numbers made the case without anyone needing to argue it. Panzerabteilung 302 filed its own loss report on September 1, 1944, barely 3 weeks into the Warsaw campaign, a unit that had rolled into the city with 40 Stu-3 control vehicles and 144 Borgward 4s, and watched most of that strength disappear before the month was out. Only 6 of the Stugs could still function. The Borgward fleet had lost more than half its number. A demolition vehicle program that was supposed to spearhead the retaking of a European capital had bled out inside a few weeks of street fighting. The radio-controlled Borgward 4s, picked off by Molotov cocktails and close-range fire, same as any other armored vehicle in that terrain, the wire-guided Goliaths, worn down one severed cable at a time by fighters who'd learned exactly where to look. No surviving German war diary lays out an internal debate about whether the program was worth continuing. That silence is its own kind of evidence. The men actually running these machines in the field would have known exactly how badly the numbers looked. Whatever they said about it in private didn't survive the war in writing, or hasn't surfaced yet. What did survive was the decision to keep building, and the propaganda apparatus never slowed down to notice. The Goliath had been folded into Germany's Wunderwaffen push, the same messaging machine that hyped the V1 and V2 as war-turning weapons, even as the war continued turning against Germany regardless. It appeared in Die Deutsche Wochenschau, newsreels presented to a German public increasingly desperate for any sign the war could still be won. One contemporary military assessment cut through that image with a single line: "The propaganda here clearly surpassed the effects of a special pioneer device in combat." The gap between the newsreel and the battlefield was not subtle. By March 1, 1945, of roughly 4,900 gasoline-powered Goliaths, built thousands, sat unused in storage, more sitting in depots untouched than had ever been sent into combat in the first place, in a war Germany was losing on every front, and could no longer afford to stockpile equipment it wasn't using. Total production across every variant by the time the assembly lines finally stopped in early 1945 ran to 7,564 units, nearly 3,000 of the original electric model, and closer to 5,000 of the gasoline versions that followed it, most of those rolling out of Zündap's Nuremberg works as the smaller 303A. Enough machines on paper to have equipped an entire engineering corps with disposable explosive robots. In practice, a warehouse full of unused weapons and a battlefield record that never came close to justifying the factory floor space they took up. Even the cheaper gasoline model cost roughly 1,000 Reichsmarks to build. The electric version ran closer to 3,000. That was the price of a single-use device that, by Germany's own internal assessment, mostly failed to reach its targets, spent against a war economy that could have put the same money toward a Panzerfaust, a weapon that cost a fraction as much, required only one soldier to operate, and actually worked. Germany kept building them anyway through the final winter of the war, well past the point any battlefield report could have justified the expense. Whatever reasoning survived internally, sunk cost contractual momentum, a propaganda machine that needed a prop. It left behind only the image the numbers point to on their own, thousands of giants fully built, fully armed, sitting in storage depots, while newsreels back home kept promising a machine that was deciding the war. It was deciding the size of a warehouse inventory, nothing more. Today you can see a captured Goliath up close, not on a battlefield, but behind glass at the Polish Army Museum in Warsaw, a few miles from where insurgents cut its ancestors' wires by hand. As German territory collapsed in the final months of the war, Allied forces captured large numbers of these machines, intact, pulled straight out of the same storage depots that had sat full through the final winter, never fired, never used, exactly as abundant in defeat as they had been in the propaganda that oversold them. Military intelligence looked them over and judged them of little continuing value, not worth studying as a weapon, only worth cataloging as wreckage. Some captured units were handed to the U.S. Army Air Force to use as tugs for moving aircraft around airfields. They broke down quickly. They had never been built to be used twice, let alone maintained for years of routine service, only to crawl forward once reach a target and stop existing. A machine engineered for a single mission doesn't know how to do anything else, even in peacetime, even in the hands of an army that had actually beaten it. A Sd.Kfz 303A sits preserved at the Polish Army Museum today. Another at the Warsaw Uprising Museum, a short walk from the streets where the Home Army actually fought these machines. More than 25 museums worldwide hold surviving examples in Germany at the Deutsches Panzermuseum. In France, near the beaches where naval gunfire cut this machine's cables before it could reach the tide line. In Britain, at Bovington, in the United States, in the Army's own ordnance collection. A machine built for a few hundred combat missions across every front of a 6-year war now exists mostly as a static display, a curiosity behind rope barriers photographed by visitors who mostly know it by a nickname, borrowed from a story about the machine's own defeat. Military robotics historians credit the Goliath as a foundational precursor to post-war unmanned ground vehicles, not because it worked, but because its failures were instructive. Every weakness in this design, the exposed cable, the limited terrain clearance, the operator who was never as safe as the doctrine promised, became a lesson engineers carried forward into the decades that followed, long after the war that built the Goliath had ended. That's the legacy. A failure instructive enough that people kept studying exactly how and why it failed, long after everyone who built it or fought against it was gone. Not the wonder weapon the newsreels sold, and not even history's first drone, a title that actually belongs to cruder machines from the previous World War, built in obscurity without a name borrowed from Scripture to sell them. The giant is behind glass now. The wire is gone or preserved in a display case beside it, disconnected from anything it once controlled. What's left is the shape of an idea Germany built at enormous cost, deployed across nearly every front of the war, and lost with again and again to people who had almost nothing except the patience to find where its one weakness ran. Every Goliath ever built carried the same weakness from the factory. Eventually, someone always found it.